Hello and welcome to CJJ's webinar on police use and community relations, practical strategies to build trust and positive outcomes. My name is Kate Mercier. I'm CJJ's communications associate, and I just wanted to take a few minutes to run through some technical details before we begin. First, you'll notice that all participants are in listen-only mode, which means that you are muted throughout the webinar. We will take questions at the end of the presentation, and you can ask a question in one of two ways. First, you can type a question into the questions box at any time throughout the presentation, or you can, during Q&A at the end, click the Raise Your Hand button. I can then call on you, unmute you, and you can ask your question verbally. I do ask that if you're on a cell phone that you use the questions box so that you can avoid any audio feedback issues. We will be recording this webinar, and the recording, PowerPoint, and additional resources will be posted on CJJ's website within 24 hours. You can also access the additional resources now by clicking Download on the toolbar. I'd like to take a minute to introduce our speakers today. Brian Lowe serves as a Sergeant of Patrol for the Tippecanoe County Sheriff's Office in Lafayette, Indiana. He began his law enforcement career in 1993 for the City of West Lafayette Police Department. His experiences include patrol, criminal investigations, DARE officer, evidence and property manager, and public relations officer. Since 2014, he has trained police officers on strategies about how to work with youth. James Waters has served as the Assistant Chief of Police since November 2014. Prior to that, he served as the commander of Indianapolis Metro Police Department, East District, for 3 years. He brings a wide variety of experience from previous assignments, including the Office of the Chief, Professional Standards, Vice, Narcotics, and the Southwest District Neighborhood Resource Unit. In 2010, Lisa Thurau founded Strategies for Youth, a national policy and training organization dedicated to improving police and youth interactions and reducing disproportionate minority contact. Since 2004, she has been training patrol and school resource officers and recruits around the country. She also reviews police department standards, conducts law enforcement agency assessments, and helps departments increase use of referrals to youth-serving community-based organizations in lieu of arrest. And at this point, I'd like to turn the webinar over to Lisa, who will begin the presentation.
Thank you very much, Kate, and thank you all for attending. I would like to share with you today some practical strategies we've developed at Strategies for Youth to build trust and positive outcomes with youth and their families and improve relations between law enforcement and families, as well as better equip officers to work with youth and families. Next slide, please, Katie. As Katie explained, this is who we are and what we do. We're available to speak with you on either by email at info@strategiesforyouth.org or by calling us. Please know that in addition to doing policy and training, we're dedicated to supporting agencies and finding ways to reduce disproportionate minority contact. Next slide, please. Is this necessary, training police and improving police-youth interactions? I would say it is. I think the most recent example in McWinney, Texas, made that case loud and clear, but there were several others in the last year. The impact of disparities in police-youth interactions are disproportionately felt among African American and Latino youth. And there's a lot of interesting research recently on how police youth determines general community safety, not simply the safety of youth. That's worth considering. And frankly, reform on police-youth interactions is on many people's agendas and often at the top of the list. Next slide, please. I say this, but if we go to the next slide, I say this, but I do want to mention to folks who are looking to employ some of these strategies that while for some of us it's obvious that improvement could be made, we also hear in many places that there's no need for change and everything is as good as it can be. Well, I want to put to you the question, how well does the United States equip law enforcement officers in service? So why don't you help for me answer this question on average, how many hours of in-service training do officers receive on juvenile justice nationwide? Less than 2 hours, 2 to 4 to 5 to 7, or 8 or more.
We'll just give everyone a moment to respond to the question, which is on your screen. You can select any of the 4 options.
Well, you're right. It's less than 42%. It's less than 2 hours, and 43% of you plus 15 are very, very hopeful here. We find, and if you go to the next slide, Katie, you'll see that the International Association of Chiefs of Police did a survey and found there is no training after the Recruit Academy, no requirement for in-service training, and no in-service training in juvenile justice for 5 years or more due to lack of funding. So it's strategies for youth. We ask the next question, how much training is there for recruits? And that's our next poll question. What percentage of police academy curriculum hours are focused on training recruits on the topic of juvenile justice in your state? We're asking percentages here because curriculum hours vary. 1%, 5%, 10%, I don't know. So 53% of you are right on target. It's about 1% nationally. 5 states have no training at all, so 11% of you are right too. If we could go to the next slide. You'll see that on average it's 6 hours, which is 1% of academy time on average across the country. And the topic uniformly is juvenile code, law, and rules for detention and custody of youth. 9 states claim they integrate mental health information, and I put a question mark there because we were not able to discern how they had done it, either because we could not see the curriculum or because we couldn't see it in the curriculum. And only 8 states, law enforcement academies, are responding to the obligation to address disproportionate minority contact, and only 8 states had claimed they mentioned it in their curriculum or actually had. Sometimes we could not actually find it when they said they had. The next slide, please. So the other question it's important to ask, because we make a lot of assumptions about how law enforcement is supervised and created and directed, is does your agency have policies? We find that the sources of law enforcement policies are predominantly the International Association of Chiefs of Police and the Commission on Accreditation of Law Enforcement Agencies, which are known as IACP and CALEA. There are no federal expectations or policies set, and there are very few states that set expectations about police-youth interactions in which they would introduce into the debate what they want to see as outcomes for the youth who the state is required to protect. The next slide, please. So some of the outcome of this is rather interesting. We know that traditional policing that does not take a community-oriented approach, which is very aggressive police stops, frisking youth, especially kids not charged with wrongdoing, actually changed youth conduct towards offending. Youth perceive that no matter what, they would be accused and charged. And so this form of policing in one study in University of Missouri with a very large sample of youth responding was demonstrably worrisome to very harsh approaches. And that study was then confirmed by a study conducted by 2 researchers, Tom Tyler and Jeff Fagan, looking at the data from New York City's stop and frisk stops. And they found aggressive stops doubled youth subsequent offending. So for these different reasons, both because of lack of training, lack of policies, and what some of the new research is saying about old-fashioned ways of attributing asserting authority in the best way with youth to reduce delinquency, it's time to really step up and bring law enforcement into the 21st century about best approaches to working with youth. And there's a tremendous amount of information we can use to do that. Here's another reason on the next slide, please. Data on police-youth contacts don't look so good. This is the only data we have from 4 Bureau of Justice surveys between 1992 and 2007, and about 7.5% of the total U.S. population is age 16 to 19. 3.5% have police contact as a portion of all police contact, but it's 30% of contacts involving force. So for all these reasons, it's really important for you to think in your jurisdictions, be you a law enforcement officer, a judge, a probation officer, a youth advocate, how can we shore up the skills of officers to work effectively with youth? It is a public safety matter to work with them effectively. Next slide, please. So one other thing it's important to consider is the incredibly changing role and expectations of police, because even as we're involving them more and more in working with youth, as you'll see in the next slide, we do less and less to equip them. Police have always been the gatekeepers of the juvenile justice system, and the question is, how are we teaching them to decide which gate we want kids to go into? Next slide, please. This is all the more important because as social and domestic policy failures hit, we find that police are the #1 people everyone turns to. That's because they're open 24/7. Everyone knows 911, and that's where many people, especially the most vulnerable people living in poverty, turn to. Next slide. Increasingly, too, we have promoted using police to be first responders to parental issues with children and in schools. The next slide, please. And at the same time that we're asking police to come in and assert law enforcement approaches, we're also asking them to take on an array of superhero roles in very little time, because many of them are pressed to answer calls for service. And those roles can, range from dial-a-daddy to allaying racial anxieties because there's a group of one color or another on a street corner who's frightening everyone. Increasingly, we see police being brought in to deal with mental health issues or help with large classes in school systems that don't have enough support. The next slide, please. And this is problematic because all these problems that are hitting fall in the lap of the schools and police, all of whom are very under-resourced right now, and not all of whom are very well equipped. This is further compounded in the next slide by the fact that there's also not a lot of consensus in America about how we should treat kids. You could go down my street, and if there was a 15-year-old smoking pot who was the child of one of our 5 neighbors, I could tell you you'd have at least 14 different responses about how that child should be treated. And I think police face this a lot, and you see this a lot in the media. There's no clarity right now across our country, and you see huge regional differences in how parents and the community respond to how police interact with youth. So this further complicates their work. And finally, in the next slide, you'll see that many parents who are the first to call the police also want agencies that are not the police to take more responsibility for youth who commit low-level offenses. They don't want the police to be the first social responders, but there's often absolutely no funding for these other service providers to answer that need. So we're in, not only are police caught in the crossfire here between the demands for their service and the absence of resources, but a real cultural divide about what they should and shouldn't do, and that changes, as I said, by region and by who's calling. Next slide. So with that in mind, it's interesting to know that the Supreme Court has issued 4 decisions since 2005, and those decisions have really directed the courts to interpret what happens to children at the hands of juvenile justice system stakeholders as a function of developmental appropriateness. And the first decision, which I'm sure you're all familiar with on the next slide, is Roper versus Simmons. Oh, that's the Supreme Court. And Justice Kennedy laid out in much more detail than I'm showing you here the court's judicial recognition that lack of maturity and an underdeveloped sense of responsibility are hallmarks of youth, and they're overrepresented statistically in virtually every category of reckless behavior, and therefore we can't judge them the same way. So the next slide, this is what a insurance company, and we know they're the smartest people on the earth. This is an old ad saying, why do most 16-year-olds drive like they're missing a part of their brain? Because they are, and they know only too well how dangerous it is to allow a child to get behind the wheel and charge us accordingly. Well, the third of the 4 cases the U.S. Supreme Court decided on the next slide is JDB versus North Carolina, and that directly affects how police work with youth. And I have yet to go to a single department in the United States and find that officers have been trained in the reasoning of this case, which requires that they adopt a developmental approach to understanding when officers must Mirandize children. So this case, I'm happy to share with you some of the other decisions that have invoked it, but it's very clear that the common sense reality we hold that a child's age properly informs the Miranda custody analysis has not only been confirmed and upheld and interpreted by local courts, but it has been broadly widened, which is something that ought to be of concern to you. The state where it's been most litigated for anyone on this call is California, and we'd be happy to send you a list of the decisions in a summary format. And so now police are required to consider age when they decide when to inform a kid that because they're in custody, they must understand, must be given their Miranda rules, and the child's point of view of when they feel free to go ought to determine when the officer does that. Next slide, please. So there are some federal policy directives, which I'm going to skim through quickly here, but the first is, on the next slide, the obligation to reduce disproportionate minority contact. Until 1988, until 2002 is confinement, but now it says disproportionate minority contact, which extends the obligation to police to address disproportionality in arrest rates. And all states are required to address disparities. The next slide. The other obligation is to reduce detention and incarceration. And the Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative over 250 sites is doing just that. We find that when you train officers who are going to be in a JDAI jurisdiction, why and how to work with youth when they cannot use their preferred tool of detention, implementation of JDAI goes better or faster or with less resistance sometimes. Next slide. And then finally, it's really important to know that for those of you who want to promote their chief's leadership and leadership in law enforcement agencies' involvement, this document here, Law Enforcement's Leadership Role in Juvenile Justice Reform, gives a great set of recommendations and demonstrates that many police chiefs don't know how to participate in those reform efforts and don't feel they're invited, and gives ideas about how to make that happen. So now a quick word about our two strategies for improving this rather large gap in police-youth interactions. On the next slide, please. Our training is called Policing the Teen Brain, and if we can go to the next slide, it is focused on providing a two-day interdisciplinary approach that we usually implement through a train-the-trainer model, and Brian's going to talk to that. And our goal here is to make brain science very accessible to officers in terms of a set of skills, which is de-escalation, reading signs of mental health issues, and digging deeper to stop frequent flyers, because I don't know of any department that doesn't send its officers over and over to the same house, sometimes 17, 24, 39 times, instead of stopping and saying, maybe there's another way to do this. Next slide, please. On our first day, we introduce the ideas that are presented by a psychologist, normative brain development, compromised youth, which focuses on the mental health issues most prevalent among youth, the impacts of trauma exposure of youth, and especially how youth of color enter into interactions with police in a traumatized frame of mind, and then asserting authority effectively. And those are always presented by psychologists, but introduced by law enforcement officers. The second day, on the next slide, talks more about nurture. So if day one is nature and the brain, day two is nurture and the environment. And those topics are the ones we discuss. And we always have law enforcement officers presenting this, because law enforcement officers learn best from law enforcement officers. You'll see that we have juvenile law for law enforcement discussed there, and JDAI, because we find many officers haven't been told how that works or why it's there. And we focus a lot on connecting officers to community-based assets that serve youth so that they have alternatives to arrest. And then we always involve youth at the end for skits. Next slide, please. Now, when we deal with the discussions of the teen brain, we recognize we're not dealing with a lot. Next slide. But what we want to do is have folks understand that this development of that little bitty thing you just saw is a process, right? And instead of being complete by 18, which is where many of our laws assume you become an adult, it actually completes now around 25. And I think we can all imagine people who have not yet even started. So the key part that drives us nuts is the part in pink there, emotion and judgment, because those are the last to develop in various parts of the brain, the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. And boy, until they develop, do they drive us nuts. Next slide. So what you see here is basically the amygdala in a teen proving to be the gear that drives a lot of decisions. There's basically no braking device because the amygdala is fight, flight, or freeze. And the frontal lobe, which is thinking about consequences and alternatives and wisdom, is overpowered. During adulthood, if you're lucky, the next slide please, we see just the reversal where the frontal lobe is controlling the amygdala. Hence, you hear terms like you getting control of your emotions. But the frontal lobe can think through the consequences and sequence and order what will happen next if you decide to go surfing on the roof of a car. Next slide, please. Our first day of training, which I'm going to discuss a little bit to you, is to try and help officers understand that impulsivity, self-centeredness, and resistance to authority are normal. Unpleasant, but normal. And therefore, it's normal that encounters will involve conflict, disrespect, and confrontational behavior. So you have to have strategies both to anticipate it and de-escalate it. Next slide, please. And we talk about developmental competence. This is one of the handouts I've offered to you. This definition focuses you on understanding that there's unique facets of adolescent development, and it forces us to rethink some of the assumptions we've made, the primary one being that all teen behavior is intentional and purposeful, and that they're clear on the consequences or that they could control their behavior. Next slide, please. So basically, we try and remind officers that this is what we're dealing with many adolescents, and it's not going to be fun or challenging. It's certainly going to be challenging. It's sometimes even amusing. Next slide. We try and teach officers about hot and cold cognition and how we really, really want to get kids into the cold area and the ways to de-escalate them to think that way so you can reason with them. The next one. And we talk about, next slide please, the issue of self-regulation and why it is so difficult for young people, especially if they've been compromised and have a mental health issue or if they've been repeatedly, chronically exposed to trauma. Next slide. In the end, what we want officers to do is have their strategies for use on when they go out there, and the BLT idea is be aware of your own behavior, your own language, your own timing, and watch the behavior, language, and timing of kids so you can get a read on what's really going on. And that is why we have the BLT shown there. Next slide. And what we do is play, the other part of our training focuses on youth, and we have this interactive game that teaches youth how to navigate interactions with peers and police and be aware of the short and long-term consequences of arrest and court involvement, which most youth are not. Next slide. And the game is aimed to be a break on teen action, to promote accuracy, which we find really lacking, and connect the dots for kids in a way that no one else is doing for them. Next slide. This is what the game looks like. Here's a game we did for Cleveland, where we have 2 categories for offenses, but we also have a general one on juvenile justice, police-youth interactions, and juvenile records. And Deputy Chief Waters is going to explain the Indianapolis version in greater detail, so I'll just move ahead there to the next slide. We develop game questions to be stories or scenarios, and we strongly try to rebut very strongly held myths. My favorite, most recent one is you don't need a driver's license to drive in a city, only on a state highway. Heard from a young man in Cleveland. We focus on behaviors, not assertion of rights, and we try and describe to youth what to do and what the consequences of their behaviors will be. Next slide, please. And we have two different versions that we make, one for the streets and one for the schools, where we make use of the school code of conduct to teach youth, and it's often taught by SROs. Next slide. And today, I have the great pleasure of sharing the floor with you with Deputy Chief James Waters and Deputy Sheriff Brian Lowe, who's going to speak now. Brian took our training and has been off to the races and trains now across Indiana. And I asked him to address 4 points today: his initial skepticism about the training, what persuaded him, and some of the impacts he's seen from the training, and what he would recommend to you. So Brian, please take it away. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Lisa. I'm really glad to be here. This training is something that I take very seriously. As Lisa said, this topic was brought to me in March of 2014. I went to the academy in 1994, and to this day, they told me that I was taught some juvenile law, but to this day, I can tell you I don't recall any of that. This training really, really turned me around, and let me tell you why. I'm a police sergeant. I work the night shift. I'm on the streets all the time, so I kind of know what's going on in our county. I deal with youth on a daily basis, so this training couldn't have come at a better time for me. In March of 2014, my captain told me to go to this training, what I call voluntold. I didn't ask to go it. I knew nothing about it, never heard of it, but I always go into training with an open mind, and I did this. I sat in the front row. I just began to listen, not really knowing anything about this training. And what got me was 2 roles, one as a police officer and 2 as a father. I have a 16-year-old and a 12-year-old, both boys. And this training really, really focused me in on, 1, being a father, and 2, being a police officer. And I thought of a lot of mistakes I've made over my 22 years in law enforcement. The first day, I listened to everything, and what really, really started to get me was when the psychologist who we use, Dr. Alsma, came in and started discussing the teen brain, normative development, compromised youth, traumatized youth. For 6 hours, he just mesmerized me, and I learned so much and really reminisced in my own mind my whole law enforcement career, and then also, you know, being a father as well. So that's what really got me, what I call, sucked into this training. I just started to believe in it just because of my own personal thoughts and beliefs. So I went through this, and I really got excited when our JDAI coordinator asked, and Lisa asked, you know, who would want to move on and to be a part of training other officers in our county. I couldn't raise my hand fast enough. So I signed up, and what we have now in our county is our JDAI coordinator, Rebecca Humphrey, and then we have 3 officers, myself, Aaron Gilman, who is a school resource officer for the sheriff's office where I work, and Sergeant Jay Ruzine, who is a sergeant for the city of Lafayette. The 3 of us and Rebecca have basically made a team. We meet on a constant basis. We're always updating our videos. We're taking everything that Strategies for Youth gave us, using that, and then also putting it into our personal county beliefs. So what our demographics are in our county, we've altered our training to make it fit our county, and that's what we encourage everybody to do where you're at. Currently, we do 4 trainings a year. We're always full, 20 to 30 students per class, and we have got nothing but positive responses. Probably 98%, I think, positive. Every once in a while, you'll get a police officer who may have one question or have something they didn't believe in, but very, very few. I mean, I think I can only think of 2 off the top of my head, and we've trained 100 and almost 200 so far. We have got an extremely good praise from even veteran officers who I've known for many, many years to be You know, all they want to do is do the trainings where they can fight and shoot guns and drive cars fast. They've come in and left this training and sent emails or talked to me personally about how much they enjoyed this training, and they are going to change some of the ways some of the things they do and how they deal with youth. And I think what we're getting is an excitement to leave this training and go out and actually want to kind of deal with youth, make a difference. And it's showing in our numbers too. Our JDI coordinator constantly gives us updates in arrest numbers, and everything we are seeing, it is going down. This is not strictly policing the teen brain, but we know that this is a part of it because the law enforcement officers are the first ones there. It's just recognizing students, kids in the school, kids on the street, what their mindset is. And this training has really, really opened our eyes to the youth and what they're going through, at least in our county. And I know this is nationwide as well. But I'm going to tell you a story on why I think this is good for me. It's good for our county, not only the numbers, but last year, it was after this training, I was at an event where a youth, 19-year-old youth, had an issue at a fair ride. He lost his phone in one of the rides, and he didn't want to have his phone lost. So he made a very large deal and wanted the fair to shut everything down so he could get his phone. So of course we were called, myself and Aaron Gilman. I guess lucky for him, we were two officers trained in policing the teen brain. I'm going to make this story short, but the short end is it became very, very loud. This youth, 19-year-old youth, did not want to take the answer of no, that he couldn't get his cell phone, that he could get it later that night. So not an argument, but it was more of a shouting session on his part. It began. So myself and Aaron Gilman both were in the same mindset. We knew his old amygdala was really swelled up. It was running. We knew that. We were both thinking without talking to each other. I knew what Deputy Gilman was thinking, and he knew what I was thinking. This youth did everything we told him to. He gave us his driver's license. He had a knife on his side. He gave us the knife for our safety. He was being very, very loud and belligerent. What we did was we allowed him to vent a little bit. We knew he was making a scene, but we both knew that if we were going to get physical with him, it was going to be because of our actions, because he was not to us. He was just being loud. There was a crowd developing. There was a lot of cameras. We allowed him to vent and then continued to calmly walk him towards the exit, which he cooperated, of course with a large crowd, but we got him off the property without ever him touching us or us touching him. And we were told by numerous people at the fair who saw us later that thanked us for our patience and you know, not making that scene into something it wasn't. But we also got some flack from fellow officers who had not been trained in this, who were pretty upset with us and why we allowed him to get that loud and speak. And when we explained to them that, you know, in order for us to arrest him, because he was being disorderly and we probably had every right to arrest him, we got him off the property without our faces on CNN, without our faces on YouTube or Facebook, whatever it may be. We understood the mindset of this young man, and everything worked out exactly the way we wanted it without any incident. And me and Deputy Gilman both spoke, and we tell this story at all of our trainings. If it wasn't for policing the teen brain training and the different mindset in which we both took after this training, that may have been a different outcome. 10, 15 years ago, that may have been very different in the mindset I had back then. So I credit this, and I use policing the teen brain tactics, and I tell everybody in our training, it's not a step-by-step. You know, you don't do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the kid will automatically do what you want. It doesn't work that way. It is just a different mindset. It's an understanding of what a normal youth brain development is, and then what's underneath the surface. What are we seeing, but also thinking about what that child is going through that we don't know about. So it's a lot of making our questions into trying to get those answers so we can better understand that youth. Our arrest numbers are going down. We are having great success stories with youth. It's firing people up in our area, law enforcement officers who are spreading the word to others, and we have about 200 to 300 more officers to go before we have everybody trained. But in my sense, it is a great success story for us, and I couldn't be more happier to be involved in it and to be a part of a really sweeping change in our county. And I know we're lucky because I travel around our state of Indiana, and there are other counties that aren't so lucky as us. Their leadership isn't there. They don't have the officers who are willing to take on these leadership roles. So I feel that we're very lucky where we're at. So I like to come on these. I like to tell my story, and I have hundreds more of youth, positive youth interactions, and a lot of it is because of this new concept that I was introduced to last year, and it's working in our county. So my recommendation is, if this is something that you want, get a solid training team, get 3 or 4 people that go through the train the trainer and are dedicated. Really dedicate yourself to this and get those decision makers at your agencies on board to give you the okay to do these trainings. And we are lucky enough in our county that all of our agencies are supportive, and we can just run these trainings with very minimal to no issues as far as leadership goes. So that's my story. I strongly believe in this. I think it has made me personally a much better police officer, and I always throw in there a much better dad as well, and that's important to me. So I thank you for your time. Any questions I can answer later.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you very much. And later, maybe you could talk a little, if someone's interested, about the role of the judges and the training in Tippecanoe County, too, because that has had an interesting impact. I'd like to introduce you all now to Deputy Chief James Waters, who, in addition to being a wonderful police chief, is incredibly imaginative and strategic and won't take no for an answer. So Deputy Chief Waters will tell you about how he brought juvenile justice deputy to Indianapolis and how he has shared it Indianapolis style.
Well, good afternoon. This is my first time serving as a panelist on the webinar. I am Assistant Chief James Waters with Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department. I am one of 2 assistant chiefs, and I oversee the investigations, operations, and homeland security divisions for our agency. I met Lisa Thurau and became familiar with strategies for youth about 3 years ago when I was the East District commander, and we were battling a disproportionate number of minority contacts and trying to figure out how to address that problem in a constructive way. Lisa arrived and kind of changed the culture of policing here in Indianapolis with the strategies for youth philosophy. Our officers have had a similar experience as Brian outlined. There were a lot of skeptics, including myself, but I think most of our agents, or all of our officers who've been through the training, have agreed that it's been a great tool for them in engaging not only kids but family units as a whole in a constructive way. So having said that, I'll go through. Do you know, Lisa, is the PowerPoint presentation here?
Yes, it's on everyone's screen.
Okay. Can we go to the next slide then? Okay. This is a photograph of me receiving a $10,000 check from Mr. Dave Bigo with Executive Management Services. I wanted to include this as a talking point. Both Mr. Bigo and Kartik Patel, who owns a few hotels here in Indianapolis, were businessmen that I made myself familiar with out on the east side of Indianapolis. And I explained that we were training our officers to have a more positive encounter with our young people and their families. And in short, the way I explained it was that we were hoping to produce a different outcome and tackle this problem of disproportionate number of minority contacts by changing expectations in the community. In the Policing the Teen Brain training, as Lisa outlined, we hope to change outcomes by changing expectations. So we teach kids what officers do and how they do it. We teach officers about things like adolescent brain development. And then we teach parents that we don't co-parent well, but we know people who do, and we can hook them up with that. And so I explained to Mr. Bigo and Mr. Patel that if we change expectations, when officers and kids and families encounter each other, hopefully by understanding what the intent is and how to respond appropriately, that more of those encounters end up being a positive one. And that if we can get our kids and our parents working together with police to help these kids be successful, that they could actually change a culture in a community, and as a byproduct of that, maybe help their business. So these two businessmen actually sponsored the purchase of Juvenile Justice Jeopardy. If we go to the next slide. So we had Mr. Bigo and Mr. Patel purchased Juvenile Justice Jeopardy because our grant had run out, and we didn't have any more money in our budget for the purchase of Juvenile Justice Jeopardy, and they didn't want to wait. So we partnered with the YMCA here on the east side of Indianapolis to kick off our inaugural event. We also asked Fazoli's restaurant if they would feed the kids. Our goal was to bring the kids in, feed them, then educate them on what we, the police, we're going to hold them accountable for. And that's the nice thing about Juvenile Justice Jeopardy, is that a lot of the kids in middle school don't learn criminal law, nor do the ones in high school. But we always hold them accountable for that. And so we wanted to educate them about not only the consequences of decision making, but when you encounter a police officer, what you should do and how to do it. And we also teach them how it feels to be a police officer. So we bring them in, we feed them, we educate them, and we reward them usually with something like gift cards from Simon Malls or McDonald's restaurant or Golden Corral. So if we go to the next slide, I'll show you what the demographics look like at the YMCA. And that's one of the reasons we wanted to kick it off there. And I know probably a lot of you have challenges in recruiting minorities for your agency, and we're hoping that this game will help that as well. Most of the kids in Indianapolis up until this point, first encounter with the police, have been on a traffic stop, and that's their first encounter with a real authority figure. We want, or the officer that shows up at their house to settle a dispute between mom and dad. So we're hoping through these encounters with young people like this, we can build positive relationships, change the community outcome, and then as a byproduct of that, as an assistant chief, increase our minority applicants for the police department down the road. If we can go to the next slide. This is Lisa Thurau, if you haven't ever seen her. She is incredible. She's amazing. She's doing a little role playing here with a couple of guys that seem to be informal leaders in that group. So we put the police hats on them, and we give them an opportunity to see what it feels like to be the police responding to a run of a disorderly teenager. And they start to see the frustration that an officer will feel. And that way, hopefully, it changes their behavior. They know what it feels like when the police get there, and ultimately change those outcomes. Go to the next slide. This is Chief Height. He's our chief. He came here from Baltimore, Maryland. He's been here for about 5 years. He showed up at the inaugural event. He's the one who helped secure the grant with Strategies for Youth. and actually dished out a few dollars out of his pocket to some of the kids who were playing the game. Next slide. Malcolm is a young man who was very vocal during the inaugural event at the YMCA, so we gave them the opportunity to put on that police hat. It was amazing to see the transformation of attitudes during this event. In just 45 minutes, I watched kids come in with their arms crossed, folded across their chest, head down, didn't want to play. Then they leaned forward and started paying attention. Then they started raising their hands, wanting to participate in Jeopardy. And at the end, actually walked out shaking our hands. So we changed, with this game, their attitudes from disdain for the police to embracing police. I actually had some kids walk up and hug me. If we could go to the next slide. This is just a photo of me and Indianapolis Mayor Greg Ballard. I was honored to be nominated and became the first police officer to receive the Mayor's Community Service Award, which gave the department, our department, a lot of positive press coverage. And I wanted to include that as a point to say that this philosophy that the Strategies for Youth brings in a game like Juvenile Justice Jeopardy, where we actually get parents and kids together, is such a positive message to the community that we don't just police the community, but we want to partner with families to make their kids successful and make this community more successful. And so the mayor, I think, saw value in that, and so I was honored to be the first police officer to receive that award. Next slide. So, as one of the other impacts I wanted to share with the police officers who are listening is just a real quick story. One of my community relations officers was out at an apartment complex on the Far East Side, and we hold Juvenile Justice Jeopardy at clubhouses, schools, churches, YMCAs, anywhere there are kids, we will go. And with the support of our business community, the literal buy-in that validates this vision of engaging our kids, building positive relationships between the police and our families, we will go. And so on one particular evening, we were out at Carriage House East Apartments on the east side of Indianapolis, and we had a Juvenile Justice Jeopardy game there. We fed them, we educated them, and we rewarded them. Great night, lots of parents there, positive relationships were established between the police and kids and parents. The following night, we had a homicide in those very apartments. I responded about 20 minutes after the first officer on the scene. We had a guy laying dead in the street, trying to figure out what we had, where the suspects were. I called my community relations officer who had been out there the night before doing Juvenile Justice Jeopardy. She arrived. So she arrives about 35 minutes after the first officer on the scene. And I saw when she arrived and got out of her car, the community walked straight to her. They weren't talking to homicide investigators. They weren't talking to me. They went straight to her and they talked to her about that homicide because they believed that she cared. She took the time to spend time with their kids the night before, fed them, educated them, and rewarded them, and spent time with those parents. So they believed that she truly cared, they trusted her, and they helped us solve that homicide. So it's just another positive impact of the philosophy that's promoted connecting cops and kids by Strategies for Youth. And that game Juvenile Justice Jeopardy for Indianapolis police officers is worth its weight in gold. And so thank you for taking the time to hear me. I'm happy to help anyone with their agency. I think my phone number and email address will be shared with you. Feel free to call anytime.
Great. Thank you so much to all of our speakers. We will be taking questions at this time. I know a number of you had asked, and I just wanted to repeat that this webinar has been recorded, and the PowerPoint recording and the additional resources will be available on CJJ's website within 24 hours. Just a reminder on how you can ask questions. You can either enter them into the questions box and we can read them aloud, or you can click the raise your hand button and I can unmute you and you can ask your question verbally. If you are on a cell phone, we do strongly suggest that you type your question into the questions box so that we can avoid any audio feedback issues. So I'll give everyone a moment to type in their questions. As they said, the contact information is up on the screen, and if you require a certificate of completion, you can email Jonathan at CJJ. So our first question is, how, if at all, is this training made available to school resource officers as a subgroup of police officers who work directly with schools with youth in schools?
Well, the way we do that is we have a separate training called Policing the Teen Brain in Schools. We just offered it to SROs across the state of Ohio in July. And what's different about that curriculum is that we spend a lot more time on day 2 on special education. And we're talking about learning disabilities and emotional behavioral disabilities and how officers need to understand them, and also skills for de-escalating the behaviors that often pop up in classes with children with special needs, or between children with special needs and other students, because it's a big source of bullying. We also focus a lot on the January 2014 U.S. Department of Education recommendations for school resource officers in schools to reduce school-based arrests and disparate impacts on youth with special needs and youth of color. If anyone's interested in that, I'd be happy to send a typical Policing the Teen Brain in School agenda. And we prefer it to be 3 days because there's more to cover, but we can make it for 2 days too.
Okay, the next question is, what are the costs associated with the training?
Well, the costs vary. We can do a one-off training typically for about $12,000 to $15,000, but we prefer to do the train the trainer approach and then support coach trainings, and that's about $30,000 now, starting in 2016. And that means that we're offering you a 4-day intensive train the trainer with psychologists, strategies for youth staff, police trainers from other jurisdictions. We transfer all the curriculum to you, all the materials that you should hand out and share with your officers as well as other officers. And we provide 2 coach trainings where we come and help your newly trained officers train. We provide technical assistance for a year for anyone who's gone through our Train the Trainer. We often recommend that before we do a Train the Trainer, we always recommend that you conduct an assessment of your department or your jurisdiction, and we do those too to look at both what's happening on the ground and what your policies say, because as I mentioned, some departments have no policies and some have not updated their policies to reflect current law or best practices.
Okay, I had someone ask if the training was available in Illinois, but I think more broadly, what states is the training available in?
We go everywhere, but we usually wait till we're asked because it's more polite. But we go everywhere. So we're in about 12 states across the country.
Our next question is asking you to expand upon the integration of JDAI and connecting cops and kids.
Well, for experienced officers, the idea that suddenly you cannot invoke detention to deal with a child who's been arrested is highly problematic. And suddenly you realize, I've got to do something else. I can arrest this young person, but I can't teach them a lesson through detention the way historically has been open to me. So we, and I've included this handout, talk about changing the officer's role from transactional, in other words, going in, finding something's been done wrong, arresting a young person, bringing them to the next stage in the passageway towards the juvenile justice system. Instead, we say you have to use that opportunity to be more transformational, and you are best suited to do that if you understand how young people think and what they respond to, and that you get a lot more with honey with young people than with vinegar. So in sites that are implementing JDAI, there's often resistance from law enforcement for a couple of reasons. One is it's against their historic paradigm, and often they have not heard about it from command staff, but also because suddenly it really increases the demand on law enforcement to deal with youth who they usually had handed off to another part of the system.
Okay, we have a few minutes left, and I know you had mentioned that if we had some extra time, you wanted to address the involvement of judges in the training. Is that right?
That's right. Brian, I was wondering if you could tell a story about how the judge from Tippecanoe County talks to officers as a function of whether or not they've attended the training.
Yes, our juvenile judge attends every training we have. She'll at least come in for a couple hours and address the officers there. And she has made it very clear to these officers in our county that if they have had this training and there was some type of a resisting law enforcement or some type of a physical struggle with a child, a teen, they will have to explain to her how it got to that point. And if it's legitimate, of course, obviously it is. But she says if you have been through this training and you didn't use this training, she will openly question you in court on why you didn't use the training that you received and how to deal with youth. If they have not received the training, and as she gave an example in our last training 2 weeks ago, she said one officer, I asked him if he had been through policing the teen brain training, and this officer said he had not. In open court, she said, I highly suggest you sign up for the next policing the teen brain training because you will need some of that information. So she is very, very strongly with this training and is openly uses it in her court. And so officers have to explain how they got to certain points. And certainly there's, you know, sometimes you have to use those types of use of forces against even teenagers because, you know, we all know that there's some that are just pretty battle hard, but she is very strongly supportive of it, and she makes it very clear that you better take this training and use it to the best of your ability.
Okay, our next question is, how do you evaluate the long-term impact of the training?
We have worked with departments to give us baseline data on juvenile arrests and other indicia of the impact of the training. Some departments will and some won't. In those departments that did give us that indicia, that was hardcore empirical, we've seen major declines in arrest rates. So in Cambridge, Massachusetts, it went down 65% for juvenile arrests, but 80% for runaways, which was even more amazing. Same thing with the MBTA Transit Police. We've seen this in other sites which we can share information with you about, but we also look for some of the softer data about levels of stress. And we just heard in Fresno one officer say, my stress level is down to like 40% of what it was because I just feel like I don't have to get into a physical battle with every kid. So we're hoping to find a study that will demonstrate this as an evidence-based practice, and there is no evidence-based police training on juveniles that I've ever come across to date. But this is the kind of data we can provide to others based on what we've been able to collect.
Okay, the next question is, what does the Jeopardy game entail and whether they can implement it in a juvenile probation setting?
Well, when we work with a jurisdiction to develop the Jeopardy game, we develop an ad hoc committee to discuss the issues that lead to most kids' involvement in the juvenile justice system. And we work with them to help us create the questions and scenarios and even choose the names and the locations to make it feel very real. And so that's how we did this with the New York City Department of Probation, which is now implementing the game with all their use in the 5 boroughs. And we find the game is used all over the country in the jurisdictions where it's played by probation, outreach officers, as well as school resource officers, and then youth programs use it all over the place, including juvenile defense attorneys. So we help you develop the questions. We provide it in the software and a whole bunch of other bells and whistles so that young people understand, for instance, the cost of going to court. We make that into a math game. And at what age can you do what? And we talk a lot about how completing education is a key goal if you want to earn a good living in America.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, and this is from someone in the Houston Police Department, and she wants to know, does this police training meet the criteria of annual training hours that police officers are required to have?
We can't generalize an answer to that because it changes from state to state, but we'd be delighted if you contact us and we'll investigate it and make sure that it does. We have been approved by some law enforcement academies, most recently Indiana. So, you know, I'm guessing it would work in your state.
At least I do turn in all of our Policing the Teen Brain trainings as hours to our academy in Indiana.
Thank you. So that's one example.
Okay, well, I wanted to thank everyone for joining us today. I actually sent around in the chat window the email address for Brian Lowe. I'm sorry that was left off of the slide. We will update that and upload the PowerPoint recording and the additional resources onto CJJ's website within 24 hours. I want to thank our presenters and thank all of you for joining us. And that concludes today's webinar. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.